Hi everyone, welcome to another literary adventure in podcasting. This is Words, Images, and Worlds, and on this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with author Emily Carpenter. Emily, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me, Jason. I appreciate it.
A pleasure, absolutely. I know that we're talking A Spell for Saints and Sinners on this episode. You're also the author of Gothic Town, as well as Until the Day I Die, and a number of other books. So, by means of an origins question, how did you get into this world of writing craft and sharing ideas?
I didn't get into actual writing until later in life. I was in my 40s. My kids were like sort of half grown, middle school, high school. And I had the thought that I had tried to write screenplays and hadn't been successful in the way that I wanted to. And I kind of thought, oh, if I pivot to novels, that might be maybe a little easier way in. I just wanted to tell stories. And I always loved reading, read voraciously as a kid. You know, I love movies as much as I love books. I love TV. I just love any kind of story in any form. So I think that I didn't know if I would be able to write. I just wanted to. So I just started.
Nice, nice. Yeah, you started in the world of television, right? And acting and the
Yeah.
screen.
Yeah, I really when I was a child and a teen and a young adult, I wanted to be an actor and I minored in theater in college and I did some community theater and commercial work and then moved to New York with my husband and worked for the two CBS soaps that were taped in New York, Guiding Light and As the World Turns. But I was just behind a desk. I wasn't acting. I was like watching, I was watching the writers do their thing and watching the actors do their thing. And that side of it was really cool as well. I think I gained a lot of respect for people that worked in daytime television and it taught me a lot. And yeah, so I just always kind of had that bug to tell stories in some form or another.
Yeah. Now, crafting in the world of novels, you have Saints and Sinners, Spells for Saints and Sinners. So, how did this story come about, and how was that balance for you?
So, originally this was part of a two-book deal that I had with my publisher. Gothic Town was the first book in that deal. And then I had pitched kind of informally when I originally signed the contract, I had pitched another idea for a different book that I was thinking about. And then when it came time to start working on that book, I had a different idea that was like vastly different. And I'll go back to how it came about, but I called my editor and I was like, so maybe not the first idea. I've had this new idea and it's shinier. I'm more excited about it. And she loved it, and the publisher loved it. And they were like, go for it if you want to do it. So, yeah, it came about in a really strange way. When I tell this story, I'm kind of amazed by the way, the process that authors come up with their ideas. It's so strange. I was actually watching the movie Taxi Driver. Martin
Mhm.
Scorsese, being a huge, cinephile, I was definitely ashamed of myself that I had never seen that movie. So my son was like, "You got to watch this movie." I watched it and I could not quit thinking about it. It was obviously, iconic, a classic. And I was thinking about it for days afterwards. And, it was such a had such a particular sort of maleness about it, and really prescient. And I I thought, what is the female way of telling that story? What is like
Hmm.
what is a woman who is like Travis Bickle? Like what does she do? Like how does she feel isolated, and how does she deal with that? And how does she seek power? And how, you know, yeah, so I just all of these crazy things were mulling around in my head, and I just was like, a lot of women really gravitate towards that sort of divine feminine that's found in Wicca and witchcraft. And that is a way to sort of gather your own power and sort of um, face it and deal with it and like wield it in a way. I mean, Travis Bickle collects, a hotel room full of weapons in that movie. And I started thinking, like, what if I had a character who was a witch and she also is on the outside of society, but this is how she gathers her power, and this is where she finds comfort and power. And the story just sort of grew out of that. And it's such a strange origin, but I find that stories like about people on the fringe who for whatever reason, society has kind of pushed them out, are really fascinating characters to me. And I think in my story, Ingrid goes from an outsider to being like pulled into the inner sanctum of society, the wealthiest, highest status group of people in Savannah. And just so that contrast was super interesting to me.
Nice, nice. I was going to ask about your draw to the supernatural. So it sounds like that um, connection was there, kind of embedded in the character and some of those questions that you were
Yeah.
asking.
Yeah, I think I have always been, I mean, I write very like gothic, Southern Gothic suspense stories, so there's always that thread of like, is there a ghost around the corner, down the hall? Is there a whisper of the supernatural? And so I thought with this book that I would just go full on into that area and just tell a story. I told my editor I want to take the witchcraft very seriously. This is like a real woman who really she has a practice, and it was a practice that I ended up kind of fictionalizing so that I could kind of have mastery over it in the book. Um, because witchcraft is very complicated, I found out doing my research. But yeah, I thought, that's the ultimate question is, when you go to a psychic and they tell you something and it comes true, is that because they have some sort of connection to the other side that maybe you don't have? When somebody does a ritual or a spell, does it work? Like, does it have a real effect in this real world? And I mean, that is just a question I think that we all have. Some people have decided absolutely not. Some people have decided I'm open to it. Some people, say absolutely yes, it's real, it's true, but I find it an ongoing, fascinating concept to me. Um,
Mhm.
just wanting to know, like, how capable are we of actually shaping events and having some sort of influence because of our connection with the other side?
Yeah, very interesting questions, and it sounds like, and from reading the book through NetGalley, you ground that so well in the character and the development there as well. So you have this character who is, as you said, practicing this in a real way, and so embodying
Yeah.
that and carrying it through the plot.
Yeah, I really wanted it to feel very real to anyone who happens to have a practice themselves. And so I was really, careful about doing research. And like, I didn't want it to be fanciful as much as I love practical magic and that kind of thing. That is a very fanciful approach to witchcraft and witches, and I really wanted it to feel like that Ingrid's a real girl and her grandmother taught her these things, and her grandmother got these ways and these practices and from her ancestors. And I wanted it also for Ingrid to not always be sure that it was working. It's not like in practical magic where they have a big spell book and they're like, okay, this is the spell to bring someone back to life. And
Mm.
we know that it's going to work. I mean, there's a lot more. um Ingrid is never fully sure of the effect that her magic is having.
You mentioned Southern Gothic, so I was going to ask about that importance of place and how the kind of the literature of the South, and I'm Appalachian as well, so curious about
Oh,
some of those connections.
yeah,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
I mean, that like place is story and story
Yes.
is place. Like you cannot separate those two things. And you
Mhm,
can't and I would go so far as to say you can't separate character from those things
mhm,
either. The characters that live in the South are a certain way and they have certain stories and they, behave a certain way and interact a certain way because of where they live, the history of their family, the heat and the humidity, the language and the food and the music and all of that and the sort of the ties of loyalty, I think as
mhm.
well are really important. And yeah, so I would just say those are inextricable, I can't say that, inextricably linked,
Mhm.
that there is just, you cannot, I could not take this story of Ingrid and plop it down in, Colorado. I just couldn't do it. It would be to me a totally different story. So all of my characters do have some link to the South in different ways, and Ingrid's is very much, she was abandoned by her mother at age 6, dropped off on her grandmother's doorstep, and really taken in by this woman who was a practicing psychic in Savannah, taught her everything she knows, and very loving, but also, a bit of an outsider herself. And she has grown up in this setting of Savannah that is, you know, there's a big divide between um, the wealthy and the working class. And of course, Ingrid is part of this working class community of, service workers and people that are working in the tourist industry. And they're really the lifeblood of this town, um, that sort of has a facade of um, like history and spookiness that sort of serves its tourist business. Meanwhile, you have like the wealthy, they're kind of in the background. They own all the huge houses and the banks and the thriving businesses. And so there's two worlds in this one town. And I found that really, really fascinating how they are a little bit at odds, but they have to work together to keep the city alive.
And as you said, the setting, the characters, all those relationships, Savannah's a great choice for that. It's a quite a unique spot.
It is. It's one of my favorite, it's probably my favorite city in the whole country. Um, and I happen to live in Georgia, and I just love it because most of Georgia is fairly new. Um, because as you know, during the Civil War, most of Georgia was burned down. And
Hmm.
but what remains is that very old city of Savannah that was created by Oglethorpe back when Georgia was one of the original 13 colonies. So it's got like that early colonial history, and it's just so rare to have that in Georgia. And I'm from Alabama, and there's really nothing like that there. It's
Hmm.
Alabama is like the Wild West, compared to Georgia. And so I love visiting. I'm a huge fan of houses and architecture, which are, an intrinsic part of Southern Gothic literature. And just, I don't know, there's such a feeling of, a lot of bad things happened there in Savannah. And of course, there was slavery, and enslaved people bought and sold. And I mean, so you feel the weight of all that there.
Hmm.
I feel like if you're willing to kind of stop for a minute and let it soak into you, or if you're that kind of person, um, and then you just feel there's a feeling of kind of oddity. I don't know how to describe it. It's just such a unique place. It's
Yeah.
something about being a port city. I think I heard somebody say this recently. He was talking about port cities being great places for artists to live, because a port city is where everybody comes out, like the world comes in, and they're disseminating their songs and their ideas and their pictures and their crafts and so there's this kind of wild jumble of creativity, and I think Savannah has that kind of jubilant, festive feeling.
Yeah. Now that you've lived with these characters, do you plan to revisit them?
N- I usually don't write series.
Hmm.
I have written one. My fifth book was a continuation of my first book, but typically I don't write a series. And unless there's like, I would imagine that it would take my publisher saying, look, this book is flying off the shelves. We want another one. But I've got another book planned for 2027. So if it does happen, listen, I'd be glad to revisit Ingrid. She's been through a lot.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I would hope for her some maturity, possibly, in learning from her mistakes, or maybe some revenge. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, may the creating continue in this space that you've crafted with Savannah and Ingrid, or in new spaces and literary family. If I'm a listener and I want to find out more about you and your work, where might I go to do that?
So you can find me on Instagram. I'm emily.d.c. And on Facebook, it's just Emily Carpenter.
All right. All right. Well, many thanks, Emily. Glad to talk with you, and certainly glad to have you back anytime.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.